Good afternoon, everyone. This is the panel on unleashing biology for energy, or unleashing biology on energy, or unleashing the panel on thinking about biology for energy. The format for today is going to be what you've seen in the previous sessions, that is, a brief round through the panel, letting everyone have a chance to explain their point of view and their particular prejudices. And then, one hopes, a fair amount of time for discussion with the audience on subjects of mutual interest. My name is George Whitesides. I'm a professor of chemistry at Harvard, previously a professor of chemistry at MIT, so that I like both engineering and science. And I'll introduce the group in just a moment. But what I would like to say by introduction to this session is that, to me, this area is one of the most interesting in energy because it is the least well defined at the moment. We know many of the parameters in other fields that can contribute to energy. But biology has the very interesting characteristic that, on the one hand, there's a supposition that there's a lot of land area and very sophisticated things called plants are growing all over it, and sunlight is falling on it, and there has to be some way of doing something with all of that. And by the way, our ancestors burned wood very happily to cook food. On the other hand, how do you do it? And the other hand has the characteristic that biology and applies to plants, and biology has been one of the areas since the 60s where science has truly exploded. Our understanding of biology and what can be done with biology and how to understand biology is many orders of magnitude in almost every vector that you can think of farther advanced. So there's a very appealing subject, which is sun falling on self-assembling, self-synthesizing apparatus for capturing photons and converting it into chemicals. And on the other hand, some brilliant science. And how do you put it together? And that's what the panel will talk about. And the panel has collectively thought about the subject and made the decision that it's not going to think small thoughts, it's going to think very radical thoughts. So you should judge these people for their ability to inflame your passions and cause new ideas to happen. One of the characteristics of energy, as we think about it in the United States and in the developed world, has the characteristic that we do have a basic notion of energy as a cost-constrained commodity, with perhaps a boundary condition that comes from global climate change, CO2, water availability, things of this kind. What, of course, one really needs to think about is the entire story. That is, it's all well and good to say we have photons, but the density of photons is different from place to place. Plants grow in water or on soil. What is that, and how do we think about those things? How do we think about the definition of a plant? I mean, what is the most radical way that one can think about a plant? What else could a plant be? Anything that photosynthesizes, in principle, could be plant-like. And there probably are really dramatically interesting ideas that one can think along that direction. How does one think about the energy costs of harvesting and collection? How do you think about the problem that in all photosynthesis one has a 2D problem and then a 3D problem? The 2D problem is how do you collect it all in a two-dimensional space? And then the 3D problem is how do you distribute it in a world that's primarily three-dimensional? And all of these questions have a kind of flavor that has to do with the developed world, but we should remember that much of energy growth will come from a part of the world that's not us. That is, it is a part where energy is not a commodity, it may not be available, and actually it should be priced rather more for its function than for its cost. So electricity in an educational system or a healthcare system where there isn't one now has very different value from power coming out of a line in the wall here. And that's something which is important because that's really where much of the global energy utilization will come. So I don't want to impose at the beginning any views I have on this subject. I'm here to moderate. But I would ask the panel to do a couple of things. And that is, one is to think, insofar as possible, radically about the problem. We don't know what the answer is. It's in a state where the science could be asked in principle to do almost anything, but what are the limits? What can biology do that would fundamentally change the way we think about the balance between plant-derived energy and nuclear, or, pick your commodity and your biological thing. And then also to think about it not in terms of kilowatt hours, but also in terms of function. What can you do with it? How is it going to serve in different parts of the world? And globally, how does it fit into systems? And the systems can range from the generic, what's the best use of an acre of land, to the question of, should I think about making photosynthetic pigeons that, do whatever a photosynthetic pigeon would do? I'm leaving that up to you, George. So, with that, let me just start by saying that we have three experts, George Church, Patrinos, and Martha Schlichter, who come from quite different backgrounds. They will each introduce him or herself, knowing better than I do what their particular prejudices and skills are. But what I think we should do is to start by just going through the three. Each one of you, if you would, take about 5 minutes and say what you think needs to be said to set the stage for the discussions. And then after that time, we have microphones set up, and we will try to move through questions from the audience and have a discussion. The only thing that I would ask from those of you in the audience, and I will remind you, is that a short question that can be answered quickly is something which keeps the blood pressure down from all the other people who are willing to ask short questions and keep the time down. So think about your question, phrase it in a kind of haiku-like fashion so that it comes to the point and it can be answered ideally yes or no. And with that, George, I turn it over to you. You want to just work from there or work from here? You have slides here, yeah?
No.
Okay, no slides.
So I guess I'll work from here. Encourage me to keep it short. I'm George Church, professor of genetics and member of the Beast Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering, who are represented here among the awardees. I guess I'm not going to get as radical as photosynthetic pigeons, although I do have an interest in those. But maybe more radical, which is that when we say that something that we have kind of a dichotomy between the inorganic and the organic world represented here at this meeting, and one of the interesting advantages that molecular biological engineering has over almost every other form of engineering is that we have, when we want to make a electronic device of some sort, we typically make a prototype and put a lot of effort into that. But with biological systems, we can make trillions of prototypes, and if we're clever enough about selection, we can use laboratory evolution. So that's a big deal. It's not an assumption that it's that easy to catch up with biology either. So, for example, various groups have estimated that biological systems are somewhere between 5 and 8 orders of magnitude more efficient at computing than computers are, the best computers are, in terms of operations per joule. That's a big deal. More and more of our energy is going into exactly that problem. So in terms of decisions that we're making today, kind of at this meeting, there are going to be issues about whether we build up complicated structures and then tear them down, like do we build up cellulose and then tear it down, or do we just secrete fuels directly? Do we make terpenes or fats, or do we make hydrocarbons, which are useful in jets? Jets are not going to be electric any day soon, we've heard. If I were dreaming, I would say that, but I'm dreaming about biology right now. Photorespiration or carboxysomes, which is a way that cyanobacteria help us to handle oxygen in these oxygen-producing systems. Do we use prime land, or can we use marginal land? Do we use fresh water, or can we use salty water? Generation time, if we're doing biological engineering, do we want a generation time of 2.5 hours, or do we want a generation time of months? This makes the prototyping cycles and the evolution potentially game-changing. Do we want photovoltaics and electrosynthesis or direct photosynthesis? If the biological systems are evolvable, we should be able to overtake photovoltaics and retain the advantages of having the evolvable chemistry to make very complicated or very simple structures. So one of the differences between photovoltaics and photosynthesis is the wavelength range, but there are photosynthetic systems that go way further red than current systems, maybe out to from 750 to 1100 nanometers. But whether or not one uses electrosynthesis or direct photosynthesis, in order to make complicated structures, which seems like more and more that's what we want to do, biology is going to be part of it. And really the question to be asked, is there really anything that we're manufacturing today that we could not manufacture better using a synthetic biological system? And that includes many of the things that we use energy for today. They're automatically greener using biology, but could they also be considerably more cost effective? So I had plenty more to say, but maybe we'll save that for the discussion.
All right. Chris.
I'll stand up because there's something genetic about that. I feel more comfortable standing up and speaking. We were instructed, as you've heard, to think big, to look at the big picture, and also not to make any specific ads for programs or companies. My name is Patrinos, and I'm with a company called Synthetic Genomics for several years now. And before that, I spent almost 30 years with the Department of Energy and several of the national laboratories involved in several aspects of the energy picture, of the energy landscape. I am very much a bullish person with respect to the application of biology in energy. I became that way when I first joined the department and specifically the Office of Science, because I was fortunate to be first a spectator and eventually a bit player in what is perhaps one of the most important programs that the federal government has ever funded, and that's the Human Genome Project. Most of you know that the Department of Energy started the Human Genome Project and was an integral part of the completion and its success. Even though there were many other technologies that contributed in the transformation of biology, as you've heard already, from something that was primarily phenomenological into a more rigorous and exact science, such as structural biology, computational biology. You've heard for many, many decades now, biology has been building up to that. But at least in my book, the Human Genome Project represents that transition when we went for something really very phenomenological to something very rigorous. It's sort of the major milestone. And I think it's that success that perhaps has given us the audacity to refer to things such as unleashing biology for energy and many of the other superlatives that are associated with this field. I mentioned the Human Genome Project, but as the one that, in a sense, harnessed the tools from the physical sciences in one application in biology that was such a milestone. Important also to mention it was the migration of the minds, the many physical scientists that saw the opportunity and made the transition from their science into biology, and it's that interrelationship, that cross-fertilization that has given us the audacity in the biological field to think big and to significantly be very forward-looking in what we can expect from biology and its applications. This was sort of one vignette to put it in context. I also want to refer to another area that I'm particularly interested in, and I will maybe say a little bit more in the course of the Q&A, and that's the promise of that algae have in the biofuels business. And I'll give you a little bit of vignette to put it in context. When I first joined the Office of Science, I was a lowly detailee, and I befriended some people in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, particularly people in the Aquatic Species Program, which is the predecessor to the algae programs that we have today, both in the government, but more importantly in the private sector. The year was 1995, and I remember very much the day that my friends in EERE went to OMB to defend their program, as usually is the case. And it was, as it turned out, either that day or that week when the price of a barrel of oil had dropped below $10 a barrel, below $10. And when they were asked how much would it cost the American public to produce a barrel of oil from algae, they were very honest and straightforward and said $100. So this was a case where the OMB examiner said, for something that I can get for a tenth of the price in the open market, why would I fund you to do this? And that was the end of the Aquatic Species Program. Since that time, it's been resurrected in various forms, but it's important to note, and for me it was a major milestone. I was relatively new. It was the year that I ascended as director of the Office of Biological and Environmental Research, and it was around the same time that I had received a proposal from some crazy scientists that promised to sequence the microbial genome using shotgun sequencing. And I sent it out for review. You know, I was new in the job and I wanted to do a good one, a good job. All the reviews came back, this is not going to happen, the guy's crazy, you're going to waste the public's money. But you know what? I consulted some colleagues, and in the Department of Energy and the Office of Science, they give you enough rope to hang yourself in terms of going against the reviewer's comments. You can't do it consistently, but you know, you can do it some of the time. Well, it turns out that was the proposal that Craig Venter had submitted, sequence Haemophilus influenza using shotgun sequencing. I couldn't get the money out of the door fast enough, you know, with my own initiative, because in the meantime he had found other monies, private monies, to support that particular project. In many ways, the rest is history. I was at least successful in bankrolling many of the other genomes that he subsequently sequenced, and also this is the shotgun sequencing method that all these wonderful reviewers were saying won't work, but it worked, and it worked also for the Human Genome Project. So for me, these two vignettes that I mentioned, the Human Genome Project and also what happened to the Aquatic Species Program and what's happening today with algae, these two are the ones that give me the audacity to feel that, yes, biology can be unleashed, and not all problems are going to be solved by biology, but like George said, I can't perceive any other major advance on the forefront of biology, of energy, whether it's in fuels, whether it's in carbon capture and sequestration, where biology won't play a major role, if not the significant role. Thank you very much.
Martha Schlicher, I lead bioenergy efforts at Monsanto. So I'd like to start with maybe reflecting on where we're at today. You know, the sun is shining, that means plants are growing, and that means biology is collecting energy, right? We're doing a really great job of that today around the world, able to really collect in that biomass probably 2 or 3 times what we need in terms of global petroleum use. But that's where it stalls, right? We can't figure out what to do next to make that economically and environmentally viable. We today are displacing about 10% of our gasoline use with renewables from biology. That's also a pretty great accomplishment. But that's with about 15 million acres of corn on a net basis, and so obviously that's not going to be the total solution either. So where I like to think about how we can think about a future that creates bigger and better independence than what we've created today, I have to try to think of it in a way that's independent of policy, that's independent of kind of entrenched interests, because I think with that kind of fickle pulling the roots up every other year, we're never going to get there. So one of the really great things to me about biology is the fact that biology really cuts across all of the sectors of our society, and some that are much more willing to invest than we historically have been willing to invest in biology for energy or even in biology for agriculture, and that's human health. And I think Ari pointed to it really nicely. We have made phenomenal advancements in human health, which is very well funded, relatively speaking, and those advances, that investment in biology that led to the Human Genome Project, have been phenomenal for the fallout they then create for both agriculture and energy. So, you know, the time that these guys took to reduce, 13 years to a fraction of a day in the human genome is now having far-reaching consequences in biology, in plant production agriculture, as well as in the types of biology we're talking about for conversion science. So in production agriculture, what used to take us, trillions of sequences and plants to be able to pick out the one we might like is now 1 in 5. And so we don't even know what that's going to mean for the future of what we're going to be able to produce per acre. But to me, the most exciting thing that has happened that I really view as revolutionary is that combination of biology and organic chemistry that lets us better design what we want an organism to do. And so now, with the companies, that have been mentioned over the past couple days, Amyris, Solazymes, and others, the fact that they can now take any feedstock and convert it to anything that could have been made from petroleum is, I think, just an incredible breakthrough that allows us to not only produce the energy that certainly we can get from solar and wind and nuclear and other sources as well, but liquid fuel, biomaterials, bioindustrials, bioproducts that lets us kind of completely envision a world without those 33 billion barrels. And the other thing it really does is it decouples it from the production side of agriculture. Now, obviously, working for Monsanto, I love production agriculture. But we've also learned the hard way that it's really, really hard to be able to identity preserve, to create designer crops in the field and plan for 15 to 20 years out and have them meet all future needs. It's really great if you can decouple those two processes and optimize agricultural production for what makes sense, the best use of that acre, to maximize output and minimize input, and let the market dictate where it will go, and then be able to sit there on the processing side and be able to pick your lowest cost, best feedstock for conversion to make a bioindustrial, a biomaterial, or a bioproduct. So to me, that decoupling, that frees up the ability to use biomass to produce jet fuel, diesel, hydrocarbons, and plastics without me having to figure out a way to do that in the crop that certainly isn't very energy efficient or the highest energy yield per acre, I find a pretty liberating way to think about the use of biology for energy going forward.
Let me just ask one question of the panel to set the next period of questions. I would like to hear from each of you what you think, if you look 20 years into the future, what will be that technology from biology that has had the greatest impact on energy production, energy preservation, conservation, substitution of energy by something else? What's your prediction? Anyone can start who has a clear answer.
Well, I believe very strongly that there is no such thing, as we like to say, as a silver bullet. It's going to be a silver buckshot. And I think the applications of biology and the energy landscape will be very multifaceted. It will depend very much on where you are and what time of the year. I think our ability to engineer organisms is going to be significantly greater than it is today, and maybe even greater than some of our wildest dreams. And therefore, our ability to, in some sense, harness nature wherever we are for producing a biofuel, for example, or enabling sequestering carbon in another place, focusing on more agriculture, more aggressive agriculture somewhere else. So there's not a single thing. I think it's very many advances across several fronts.
Okay. George?
Yeah, I think 20 years is an incredibly long period of time now. It used to be, a lot can be done in 20 years, I guess is what I'm saying. We've seen a change in our exponentials that we're used to, from sort of 1.5-fold per year to 8-fold per year in terms of cost of various biological things like reading and writing DNA. That doesn't mean that's going to extrapolate to every other field, but anyway, if you take synthetic genomics, which Ari would say is a major component, and say what might that look like 20 years from now, it could be that it just like we can currently print anything we want, when we used to have to go to a printer to do that for Gutenberg, we should be able to print literally anything we want, and that might eliminate transportation in an extreme sense. It might eliminate waste of food. A variety of things are possible once you think in terms of being able to print whatever you want, being able to harvest the energy as locally as possible. A lot of times we think, it's impossible to have anything other than centralized energy because the economies of scale don't scale down to the household or to the community or something like that. But that presupposes a manufacturing mindset that isn't necessarily going to be true 20 years from now.
Okay.
So for me, it's thinking about how these disciplines are now all overlapping, and there's been a discussion often today about cost experience curves. And I think we're seeing now cost experience curves apply to really that intersection of agriculture and energy, so that anything we do gets looked at through the lens of anything else. So agriculture being used for energy means we're now looking at the carbon footprint of agriculture, and we're forcing that industry to improve its carbon footprint in a way that it didn't used to get paid for when that was animal feed or food production. I think that's a really good thing. That's going to improve water quality. That's going to improve productivity. It's going to get the whole sector looking at ways to utilize less nitrogen, and maybe it's a future plant where corn has soybean roots and works nicely with a cover crop. That was never motivated before. But the other benefits are anything we learn for that use for energy is also going to then benefit the use of it for food or for feed production. And because of that, benefit of cost experience, you're going to take already a really productive sector and now make it better for anything it does at a time when you really need that efficiency in order to meet global food, feed, and fuel demands. That's exciting to me as we look to George's challenge for what to do about a lot of the developing countries that don't have the infrastructure in place yet. So they might start looking at systems where everything stays far better contained if they can produce their feed, fuel, and energy all in an ecosystem that takes the carbon and the water right back to the environment from which it came. And to me, only when we start thinking about it in that ways in the developing countries can we think about meeting the growing demands at the same time as we're addressing the environmental and economic challenges that will be associated with asking them, to do it in a way that we have evolved to in wanting to be good stewards of it.
Thank you. So why don't I open the questions now to the floor. If you have a question, please stand up, and there's a microphone right there in the center, and I think there's a mobile microphone somewhere. And say who you are, and if you would care to say to whom you're speaking, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll just throw it open to the panel to discuss.
Hi, I'm Greg Washington. I'll just throw this out to the panel. When you can create anything, there's not only you're not only dealing with that ability, but you're also dealing with the responsibility on the other end of that. And so I'm very interested in what do you think should happen on that side of the house as the technology and as the science is being progressed technically. Should something be happening on the ethical side of the house in order to balance what it is we do?
Mr. Washington, I want to congratulate you on the clarity and brevity of your question.
So in around 2004, I had similar concerns because we were doing some of the first experiments to get DNA off of chips for use in synthesis, bringing the cost potentially down by 3 orders of magnitude or so. And so in 2004, I produced a white paper that was broadly distributed, proposing that we essentially do licensing and surveillance, analogous to say automobile licensing. It's not a huge burden for everyone who drives an impactful piece of metal to meet certain standards. And in this case, synthetic biologists would give up a little bit of their freedom because nobody's forcing them to be a synthetic biologist, and they would be under surveillance, and they would have to report everything that they synthesize, either via, the computers would essentially monitor every piece of DNA that you make, or anything that involves an instrument certainly could be tracked and checked against what you're authorized to do. And so some transparency there, and maybe a little infrastructure of checking of new threats that emerge with time. But I think it's a very important problem. And then there is another set of problems that we've also been addressing, which is that's purposeful, and then the other one is accidental, where you need to make your synthetic organisms on a short leash, where you've thoroughly tested what the consequences of them getting into an environment would be by having the environment in the lab under physical containment, as well as biological, metabolic, and genetic containment, and then testing those thoroughly.
Martha or Ari, do you have anything you want to passionately say on this? Yes.
I'll speak more of the commercial end of it. To me, clearly, any genetically modified organism, be it in crop production or in processing of a feedstock, I think has to go through a rigorous regulatory process and framework, and that needs to be global as well as local. And I think certainly good systems have been developed for that on the crop production side. I think they've been very successful. Obviously, similar systems have to be developed on the processing side.
Ari?
So I can say that we learned from the nuclear energy experience about how not to do things. So quite frankly, I spoke earlier about the Human Genome Project. From the very beginning of that particular project, the founders, the people that launched the project, became very, very quickly aware about the ethical, legal, and social implications of undertaking such a project, and mandated, and the Congress went along, a significant percentage of the funding for the project was devoted to exploring in a scholarly way those ethical, legal, and social implications, interacting with society in many dimensions in order to put in place the safeguards to avoid any abuses. And the same thing followed when synthetic biology became a possibility and was launched. So I am very proud of how that community was quite aware of the errors of the past and has been very proactive in making sure, as I mentioned, the safeguards are in place and that all avenues for avoiding the risks are pursued aggressively and successfully.
Next question, sir.
My name is Steve Brumley. I'm from the University of North Texas with a joint position with the Australian Institute for Bioengineering and Nanotechnology. I have sort of a couple things here. One is that we've been engineering sugarcane to function as a biofactory for production of industrial chemicals like bioplastics. And this has been a stepwise process where we insert a gene, we study the plants, understand what's going on there. And where we're moving to now is more of a systems approach, where we're losing the genomics, the transcriptomics, the metabolomics, the proteomics to plug into a model that we can then start to study in silico the sorts of implications of what we're doing and then advance that to the wet bench phase. So I'm just interested in your responses to that. And the second question I have
You get one question at a time.
Well, the next part is directly related because this sort of metabolic engineering in plants is going to be stalled or stifled if the onerous regulatory processes that we have to take genetically modified plants, and in my personal opinion, all of agriculture has been genetically modified for about the last 12,000 years. If we keep this unbalanced, onerous process on genetic engineering and do not allow our plant breeders, which are very, very good at doing the selection processes, to do the work that now we require a bunch of lawyers and accountants and people to write enormous amounts of justification of why their work is safe and can go forward.
Martha, why don't we start with you on that?
Sure. So applaud your work in sugarcane. You picked a tough one to start with, and certainly because of the difficulty in breeding and introducing a gene in sugarcane, it makes it far more complicated and more onerous than some of our other crops. But I share your frustration, but I also know that the introduction of biotechnology is still relatively new around the world. And so we have to have every country develop and get comfortable with a regulatory process that the global community is then comfortable with so that we can maintain free trade. So while it might be frustrating for us within the U.S. that have gotten very comfortable with, I think, biotechnology and the safety of biotechnology, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring along a lot of other world areas, their regulatory capabilities, their scientific communities, in order to develop that same level of comfort. And I think for all of us in the world, or in the room, that feel very comfortable with the science, that can be frustrating. But we have to have a consumer, a public, a legislator also comfortable. And so I think it's going to take time, and it's going to take the development in a framework that allows all of those individuals to come along and see the safety to be able to have things probably move in a more expedited fashion.
So I think we should move to the next question if we can.
Like having BASF move out of Europe with their plant engineering because of the onerous regulations that are preventing them from marketing their stuff? I mean, what's the lesson?
Yeah, obviously Western Europe's been very difficult, and obviously, because of that decision, many of us have elected to not move forward with biotech in those countries.
Any comments on the system?
Next question, please.
Hi, Rich Blanche, environmental journalist. I wrote on this month in Bioscience on the biology of ARPA-E. Sorry to continue on this vein of the politics and the ethics, but you look at GMOs, it is a world of disconnects and receiving and policy and politics, and now it's not just that, it's also genetic resources. There are important agreements that the United States is not a party of. What are some of the things that we can do to make the politics of biology less strident as it looks to energy?
Okay. Well, there's no alternative to education. Information exchange and openness in the communication process. Related to also the previous question, it's connected to how you asked. I'm a lot more optimistic, for example, about the Environmental Protection Agency here. I've been in many years in government, so I've had many colleagues that I've gotten to know in the Environmental Protection Agency, and I see significant expansion in their horizons with respect to the potential and the ability to safeguard many of these advances in molecular biology and specifically synthetic biology. So even overseas, and I know the problems with Western Europe, like you've heard from Martha a few minutes ago. From my point of view, it's not a matter of having different ethical standards, it's more a matter of competitiveness. Most of us are too polite to make that particular case, but that's in fact a truth. And it is also true that the European Union, that I follow quite closely, is pushing very, very hard for reforming some of the onerous regulations with respect to GMOs and synthetic biology and the like. So I see winds of change in this, and I'm optimistic that even though we will go through some difficult times and there will be hurdles to jump, we will, especially on the 20-year horizon that George asked us to think of, we will have more uniform standards and regulations and regulations that will enable this industry to flourish successfully and financially also very profitable.
Sir.
John Anda. I teach a class on financing green energy at Yale School of Management. My question is for George Church, but others as well. It's an institutional question. If somehow biological processes could use the world's 30 billion tons of CO2 emissions post-combustion, or even create biofuels usable by existing infrastructure, that could be the difference between getting on a 450 path and not, or Martin Weitzman's tail skimming or not. And I wonder to what degree there's a bias within the research community that recognizes the potential linkage of utilization of CO2 and existing assets in the direction of your research in bioenergy.
Don't go far, because I want to make sure I understand your question. You're talking about, I guess you're picking me because we have some research that it pertains to carbon sequestration into useful products. Yes. For example, in a company I founded called Joule, and I think it doesn't translate well into academia, but it's certainly that mission is present for a certain subset of researchers in the private sector that are developing this. It's a huge advantage photosynthetically if you can have 2% carbon dioxide rather than 0.03% ambient carbon dioxide. It basically, combined with the cyanobacterial carboxysomes, it means there's essentially no penalty for photorespiration, which is what people make fun of all the time with Rubisco and whatnot. So I get. I'm not sure that answers your question, though. Is that what you were asking?
Well, yes, I'm aware of Joule, and Craig Venter, certainly at Synthetic Genomics, has had some of the same aspirations. You know, my real question is that, as an institutional matter, say in the U.S., it's not that expensive to decarbonize. Yeah. It is, however, a problem of stranding a lot of assets. It's a problem of not utilizing natural assets like China's coal or U.S.'s gas or our coal. And so, in theory, you might say that the pressure might be on biology, that if you can create things for existing assets, let alone if you could use CO2 post-combustion, you may allow the world, the U.S., starting with the U.S. and the world, to tail skim on climate change risks, whereas nuclear might be able to do that, but we're not going anywhere with it.
Right. So I think so
that's really the.
Right.
That's
I think this is a potential win-win, is basically what you're saying. Yes. And what I'm saying is that the small subset of groups that are working towards using that abundant carbon dioxide that's highly concentrated can take care of the sequestration, and it gives them an easy end to to producing whatever fixed carbon they want to use that for. So that's one of those rare win-wins, and we'll see how it works out. I mean, these are in pilot stage, production stage. It's no longer fantasy, but we still have to see how it scales up.
Let me just make a brief remark on this, though, and that is that there's also this, what we loosely call balance of plant. And so the issue of thinking about increased CO2 concentrations is, of course, a perfectly practical thing, but there's also the upstream gas separation facility. There's trying to figure out how you capture carbon from what, how you distribute it, how you contain it, and then having a co-located carbon dioxide source and a large area of land in which you can grow something, or water. It's the systems problem is one of these 2D to 3D problems, and it's expensive.
As is the institutional barrier of, whether it's fossil fuel companies or their assets. That was my only point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name's Ed Carapeza, and I'm with General Atomics and also Carnegie Mellon University. I'm an engineer, not a biologist. But I've been reading a lot about synthetic biology in the last 6 months or so, looking at the papers on the circuits that have been described and whatnot. And then I read about an initiative called Living Foundries, where they're trying to push the state of the art in synthetic biology. So now that we've got these 4 experts here, my question is, now that there's all these genomes that are being defined, what do you see as kind of the real long poles in going from where we are today to actually manufacturing biological entities using tool sets? I guess in the case of biology it would be tools for metabolic networks, simulations, and whatnot. So I guess the general question is, where do you see the long poles in moving forward in this area of science?
Let me start with Martha on this. And the only thing I would ask, since the mere mention of synthetic biology makes all biologists incredibly gifted in their ability to continue to speak, I would ask all of us to be relatively brief in answering.
So to me, the exciting thing is I agree we're there. I think it comes down to practical reality, economics, energy balance, environment. And those are the 3, big things in the room that for any system we might develop that we're going to have to solve. A small fraction will turn out to make sense.
I'll try to be brief. From my point of view, it's the absence of a foundation of knowledge in this field that will probably be the long pole. I think the promise is there. Some of the early successes have been accomplished. The potential is understood, but we don't yet have all the tools that we need and the knowledge to plan ahead, as compared, for example, to the physicists that have been around and have had the big toys for hundreds of years, for 100 years at least. There's the difference. That's the long pole.
George?
Yes. Briefly, I think compensating for that lack of knowledge is we have a tremendous gift of infrastructure from 3 billion years of evolution. Plus, we have the ability to evolve on a laboratory scale at potentially, smaller scale and shorter time, but much faster and much more directed. We do have enough knowledge that it's actually relatively straightforward exercise today to go from comparative genomics, say, to find a few enzymes that are necessary to turn fatty acids into alkanes. That was a nice science paper. I really think that the ability to harvest from the biosphere is getting easier, and our ability to then engineer those into complicated systems. We don't have to understand everything in order to use it. I mean, for example, vaccines were very useful many, many years before we understood immunology, if we do even today.
And I would add to this only that there is now one, I think, very interesting case study, which is the DuPont process for converting glucose to propane 1,3-diol, which required it's a relatively simple transformation in some senses, but it was quite an arduous and technically demanding one to actually carry out. So I agree with George that many of the pieces are there to do this, but it isn't simple to do yet. And when you get finished, you then have to ask how much it actually costs, and that can be a complicated story.
But that example is a beautiful example because it was done entirely before the modern tools were available.
That's correct.
I think that could be redone very quickly.
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. Next question, sir.
Yeah, I'm Wayne Curtis. I've been teaching biochemical engineering for 25 years at Penn State. And every year I have an astute student that points out the lie about what I think is one of the major problems here. And that is we talk about these as biocatalysts. And I'll have a student tell me, how can you call it a catalyst if you kill it? And now you take that and you start talking about producing energy on a very large scale. And if you take the molecules and they're still inside the organism, you're going to have to kill it to get it out. If you release it to the environment, or now by secretion or anything else, you've now taken a higher energy molecule and you've placed it in an environment where everybody else can access it and eat it, including biology. And so to me, there's this paradox of, are you really using it as a biocatalyst to produce fuels, in which case it's not going to be consumed by reaction by definition of a catalyst, or if you're going to try to release it and actually use the organism as a catalyst. And it seems to me that that's a major limitation to using biology as an energy production system, is the scale in which you're doing this. If you're going to release those molecules to make them actually recoverable, they will be consumed by the very organisms that are also in the environment. And aseptic processing on million-liter scale is what we're talking about in the fuel industry.
Martha?
So I'd say that's not a given, that's a choice. And I would say in the 20-year time frame, the idea of many more of those being immobilized as catalyst is probably far greater possibility than exists today. And I think today, with the constraints or limitations of our systems and the economics, what you often find is co-production, where the organism also ends up being a part of the ultimate value chain and ends up being a part of what makes the difference between profit and loss between the overall system. So I would envision a world in 20 years where that could look quite different, that the value in the organism becomes so high you found a way that it stays immobilized or stabilized to be able to be reutilized continuously in the process that the economics don't justify today.
And after all, when you think about something like reforming, you kill the catalyst every couple of minutes.
But you could regenerate it in seconds.
Well, in this case, you, as we said, regrow it, but it has a similar kind of effect.
Right.
I mean, yeast is a great example where in a brewery it gets regenerated today, right?
I would add that if you're worried about organisms in the environment eating the secretion products, I mean, that seems like something over the next maybe even less than 20 years is a solvable problem. We can certainly do it on small scale economically, so it should be scalable. I mean, there aren't that many organisms that like to eat gasoline, for example, and you can start with a sterile culture.
Sir.
Alon Hochbaum, University of California at Irvine. To hear the responses and introductions that the panel members gave, it gives the impression that synthetic biology is the answer to the question, what are the barriers to unleashing biology on energy? Is that a consensus of the panel, or do you see other significant technical challenges that stand in the way of using biology for the purposes of global scale energy production?
A very good question. George, you want to start on that?
Well, I think it depends on how broadly you define synthetic biology. If you include in there the computational simulations and you include exotic evolution and instrumentation and bioreactors as part of synthetic biology, then I'm inclined to think that it is a rather large chunk of the solution. If you find it very narrowly to be, say, recombinant DNA or something, then no, it's not a sufficient explanation. No.
Martha?
I'm a firm believer that we need everything. I just think biology has the opportunity meet a lot of the needs that we can't meet with some of the other renewables because of its ability to provide a liquid fuel to planes, to produce biomaterials, to produce bioindustrials. The breadth of what it can do, and thus the synergies we get from, doing that for multiple sectors, I think gives it a great advantage.
But is engineering whole organisms the only way to go about doing that?
No, absolutely. I'm a fan of everything. I just think biology has huge opportunities to contribute.
If I could add something, I actually have a passion for computational biology. I think that's a frontier that can have, if successfully reached, can have far-reaching effects. The ability to computationally simulate a single cell, for example, something that was a dream for computational biologists many years ago, and now with the hexaflop computer within our grasp, so to speak, I think we can approach that stage. And having a tool like that, for example, is going to be tremendously valuable, not just for synthetic biology, but just for understanding what we're dealing with in nature and simulating it and finding out ways by which we could harness it more successfully.
And I would remark that thinking about a plant for making, let's say, fuel, if I were thinking about it as a chemist, let's put it this way, the part that the biology does is the part that's inside the reactor, but the part that sets the price is largely the stuff that includes the reactor, the outside of the reactor, the systems that do heat management and mass transport and water control and all the rest of that. So I think there's an enormously interesting problem in moving from fairly conventional, well-established tools for large-scale process to things that are going to be quite different in their constraints of these other areas.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Corinne Young, and I work with Renewable Chemical in biopolymer, advanced material companies. I just wanted to amplify, George and Martha, some of your comments, and to say that the DuPont example is not one isolated case study. There's been exponential growth in technology in this field, and my client base alone includes companies that are scaling up that are commercial, and selling products around the world, including one in this room, Alilix. So I wanted to impart that message that biochemicals, advanced materials are not far off. They're actually here, commercial, price competitive with petroleum, offering significant energy efficiency, greenhouse gas, price and performance, and jobs benefits. And yes, in the previous manufacturing session, it's a way to revitalize and transform manufacturing here in the U.S. because of competitive advantage.
Thank you. Sir. I think that wasn't a question. That was a comment.
Christie Jansen, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and this is for George Church. I wonder what your take is on the controversy between open pond systems and photobioreactors for growing algae and cyanobacteria. Do you foresee an enormous development in material science in developing photobioreactors to make them economically viable?
Right. So the open pond systems have challenges for the amount of light distribution to the organisms, to the application of some of the carbon dioxide sources that we were talking about earlier, and to sterility issues that Wayne brought up, and others. There's a potentially factor of 10 difference in those economies, as far as I know. In terms of the manufacturing of bioreactors has come a long way since even a couple of years ago, in terms of inexpensive materials that can still last for, say, 5 years in the presence of hailstorms and other infrastructure issues that George, to my right, has brought up.
Other comments? Sir.
So, yeah, I'd like for you to comment on, all three of you actually, on George's earlier comment. Oh, I'm Jeff Blanchard from University of Massachusetts. On harvest energy locally and how that might change what energy means and how we do and capture energy in this country.
think George Church said it earlier successfully and properly that the issue of scale is what's different in what biology can really change significantly, economies of scale. I think in terms of more conventional energy production, it makes sense to have something very big, something very concentrated. Biology can change the paradigm significantly, and something more distributed can make sense and be economical at the same time.
George?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have to decide right this second whether what the ratio from local to global, but I certainly see our ability to manufacture things changing radically, and we shouldn't be blind to that. There will be more and more self-replicating systems. We won't be limited to what we currently think of as purely biological systems. There may be hybrid systems and so on. But what we now consider kind of a quaint, local farm could actually be a local industry that's quite small but still scalable.
Martha, anything?
Yeah, so I'll use kind of a real-world example here. We've been a part of a project for 4 years trying to figure out how to harvest, transport, store, and utilize corn stover and ag residue, obviously a big cellulosic feedstock. And it wasn't really until this past year that it's just started going gangbusters. And the reason it's going gangbusters is not only have we figured out what can be sustainably removed, but we figured out that today, with minor treatment, it makes a really great animal feed. So in Iowa today, you have self-organized groups that are harvesting the stover, using it for bedding, using it for animal feed, putting the manure back down on the farm, reutilizing the water, and it's all working because it's making economic sense. That's not a subsidized industry. It's working because it's making money for the feedlot of $10 to $20 per head. It's making money for the grower of $80 to $90 per acre after nutrient replacement. And so an innovative equipment operator is figuring out what modifications they have to make. A hauler is figuring out how to put more bales on for transport. And what you couldn't, push like a wet noodle 3 years ago is working because it all works environmentally, sustainably, and economically in that community. And boy, we couldn't do that on a mass scale. We can do it because all those elements are coming together in the community. So I think it takes a lot of us working to provide the technology, the information to enable things to happen, so that we can develop these clusters around the world that best utilize their resources.
And let me make a comment on this also with an illustration of something which I think is interesting and important. One of the problems with anything solar is that you have to collect over a surface, and then you have to somehow feed what you get into central distribution or transmission points. And that tends to move away from very large central plants to distributed plants, and in general, distributed plants are less efficient than very large central plants. However, I was talking to some folks who had just put up a small local energy facility which pumped water. And you say, inefficient, absolutely. What difference did it make? The difference it made was really quite interesting, that the culture of that particular village was one in which the water had been carried by people, and in particular the water had been carried by young women, girls and young women. And what happened when a pump went in was that the girls, instead of spending their time in the mornings going to the stream to carry water, went to school. And so the difference in the community over the course of a 20-year period is going to be very large. It's not based on price per kilowatt hour, it's based on education. And so the issue of thinking not just in terms of the U.S., in which electricity is a commodity, but globally, in which there's a quite different value in the facility, the capability that's generated by distributed energy, is not a substitute for the problems in the U.S., but it is another thread which I think is an interesting and important one. Sir, I apologize.
My name is Paul Pelosi. Aside from wind and solar, when we consider the 20-year vision, which do you think will have more contribution to biodiesel and to our energy used for transportation? Will it be stuff we grow in the crops? Will it be recycled items like waste or plastics or anything? Or will it be another science solution, in your opinion?
I've seen some calculations that our recyclables are not sufficient to keep us going. I think there's a third solution in addition to crops and recycle. Maybe you're including this in crops, but there's microbial resources that could be much denser could be getting more joules per acre.
I guess I'll give the answer I gave earlier as well. It depends on where you are and what time of the year. I think the picture will be a very variable one and will harness all aspects of the biotechnology revolution. Plants, microbes, the algae. It will be a very healthy mix.
Anything, Martha?
I would agree. And I think that the more things are multi-purpose, the more likely they are to be successful because they'll attract more R&D.
And one interesting comment is that Mumbai now is 50 million people and growing. And there will be a very large number of very, very, very large cities in 20 years. And the mass of material coming into them, the material is already collected. And I think we don't know how to use that. So it clearly is not an answer to the energy problem, but as a resource, it's an enormous opportunity because it's collected and unfortunately it's mixed. So one has to figure out how to deal with that. But biology certainly has a contribution to make to that.
Thank you.
Sir.
My name is Raj. I'm from MIT and we work on artificial intelligence and network intelligence. And since you work in the genetic engineering field and you stated that the time frame for genetic mapping has reduced from about 13 years to a couple of days. And my first question is how much computing power was required in terms of the factors of clock cycle to actually do this from a couple of years to a couple of days. And sensing that this pace is going to accelerate, how much more computing power will your industry need in terms of processing power as well as memory capacity to store all this genetic information so that by the time your need arises, we can be actually prepared to meet those needs. And I think that is going to be phenomenal and fascinating. Thank you.
George, you should probably start on that.
Right. So at the moment, we are going faster than Moore's Law by a considerable amount, maybe a factor of 6 per year, which multiplies out very quickly. I don't think there's a crisis, however. I mean, some people who stand to gain from it would claim there's a crisis. But, for example, human genomes are now being sequenced at about maybe 10 to 40,000 per year. And some people claim you need to have a terabyte per genome, when in fact, if it's very accurate sequence, you can get away with 5 megabytes. And the key point is accuracy. So the computational tasks become much easier if you get the technology to the point where it's very, very accurate. That's one comment. But and synthesis, which is mainly what we're talking about here, it has a lot of computationally intense problems, but not necessarily storage problems. I think we're probably on track for being able to store the sequence data that's coming in from the world, but it could get out of hand quickly because that steep exponential is not slowed down yet for sequencing.
Other comments? Yep.
As somebody who admits having made many mistakes in funding bioinformatics projects, I can tell you that is where the biggest stumbling block exists. There is not the maturity in the community. This is no criticism. It's just a relatively young community, and therefore the bioinformatics hasn't quite developed as well as parallel scientific fields have harnessed computational power. So in many ways we run the risk of losing a lot of the data and having to collect it all over again, because simply a lot of the bioinformatics systems are not going to be viable, and the software that's associated with those efforts also aren't adequate enough.
Martha?
I'll just say there's the nice side benefit of the waste heat many companies are looking at in urban areas to grow vegetables on their rooftop, right?
Let me ask a question. One class of production which we haven't talked about is arid land plants, guave and jojoba and things of this sort. And there is an argument that slow growers in land that's not going to be used for anything else, but which nonetheless act as accumulators over time, is a very interesting opportunity. Does anyone want to comment on that? Perhaps Martha?
Yeah, I think we have an evolving argument as a society over best use of the acre. And I think every acre is going to start having to be looked at in that context, because no matter what type of fuel we want to produce, it's going to require land, and it's going to require water and other natural resources. And so we really have to be looking at these really, arid environments, and I would say potentially expanding arid environments in light of climate change, that are going to be able to grow crops that can meet not only energy needs but potentially broader needs. But that really has to be done in the overall balance of output versus input versus other things that you might be able to do with that land or other land that might be available. So I think we're pretty early on in the development of many of these crops. When you really look at a lot of the life cycle analysis, or if you look at a lot of the energy balance work, biology probably the easy part of the problem to solve. And so we're still using that feedback loop of the other information of what needs to be improved in order to make it a sustainable system. And I think the critical thing is for us to keep that candid feedback loop going.
Professor Dr. Toon.
May I just add one more thing to that? It was a really good question. And I think the problem with plants that currently grow in arid areas, they might have generation times measured in decades. Right. While there's no particular reason why a desert couldn't contain bioreactors or photovoltaics that are self-replicating in some sense, or cheaply manufacturable, that could have generation times more on the order of hours rather than decades, and that's a serious thing to consider. And the spread of deserts could, in principle, be reversed by something like that.
The one trouble there is water.
But some of these organisms use salt water. Right. Yeah.
Eric.
We have relatively few durable forms of energy, and certainly historically and likely for much of the future, the most important of those has been solar radiation. So in many respects, the name of the game, whether one's talking about transportation or stationary power, is the collection of that solar radiation, the storage of that solar radiation, and then the conversion of that solar radiation, into useful work. And there are both biological and abiological ways to do all of those things. If we think about how one unleashes the power of biology on energy, is there one of those segments that, biology is uniquely advantaged for? Or is the answer to the question always, it depends? Is there one of those spaces, capture, storage, conversion, that we should look first to biology for? Or conversely, are there areas where we should first look away from biology for? So, sort of a big picture question.
Transmission is also important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who would like to take that on?
Just quick, storage and transmission is somewhat related to that. We heard earlier today how terrific it is that lithium batteries and lithium-air batteries are getting close to 500 watt hours per kilogram, but some of the biofuels we've been talking about here are about 40 times higher energy density than that. That has implications for both storage and transmission. I don't know if they're, I think that it's an interesting challenge to get to right now, the best photosynthetic systems are comparable to the standard photovoltaic systems, and there's going to be a challenge to see which of those works out in the long term.
So the question is photovoltaics versus photosynthesis. I think both will advance significantly. The storage issue, you've already heard, it's a very important one. From my point of view, photosynthesis still probably can be manipulated better and more than what you would do with photovoltaics. But it all will also depend on the time scale that you're collecting the energy and you're using it. So again, as I've said before, like a broken record, it's going to be all of the above depending on where you are and when.
So I'll just add a little bit of my frustration in that it feels to me like time really matters here. So, we've got oil as stored biology today, and we've got biomass we're generating every day where we're capturing CO2. And so when we can store it, we know we can store it for really, really long periods of time, which we're still trying to figure out on photovoltaics. But if we don't store it, it's decaying and we're creating new emissions. So the longer it takes us to kind of figure out a stable way to store that carbon, without everything being trees, we're losing, we're kind of foregoing these gains every single day we've got.
And I would make one further declivity in your distinctions there. I can say on-grid and off-grid, because I think off-grid biology could have some very clear immediate advantages. On-grid, it's a more complicated economic story. Sir.
My name is Peter Reimers with a small startup company called Aristides in Cleveland. My question is to all these opportunities in future with microbiology, do you foresee a shortage in phosphorus as one limiting factor?
Martha.
Yeah, so it obviously comes back to the critical thing of getting the phosphorus that results in the plant back on the field, right? So it's really our systems conversation of you have to return it.
Let me follow up on that question because it's, I think, a very interesting question. We tend to think of biology as growing in a free good, otherwise known as soil. And the question of the material science, the maintenance, the lifetime, all the rest of that of soil so that it doesn't run out as everything else runs out is an interesting issue. Would you all care to comment on that part of the problem?
Yeah, it's really a build on my earlier point of I think agriculture is getting far more scrutiny as it's being used for energy than it was when it was just agriculture, let's say. And I think that has probably freed up that requirement or that thinking of if I'm going to start to remove biomass, how can I do it in a sustainable way? How can I make sure I'm returning carbon to the soil? Something that we haven't looked at seriously in years. And that's starting to become attractive if the grower gets paid for those sustainable features of returning that soil carbon or recognizes that it's important to his yield. So we absolutely have to find an equation that incents and motivates returning the carbon to the soil, returning the nutrients to the soil, because that is in everyone's best interest, from all of us to the person whose land it is, that's their greatest asset. So I think everything is pretty well lined up in a way that it hasn't been probably since the advent of really modern agriculture, to be looking at the system in a way of incenting the grower to return those nutrients to the soil.
And in the future, is potassium or phosphate or nitrogen going to be more valuable as a limiting resource?
Depends on where you're at.
Yep. Okay. Sir.
Yeah, I have a quick question on a topic that really hasn't been discussed here, but it's not straight biology, but it's It's really the interfacing of biological structures to electrodes and physical entities. And obviously there's been a lot of work. Angela Belcher at MIT has been working with getting organisms to build thin film lithium batteries by picking up lithium and depositing it in a certain way. There's a recent article in Science about biophotovoltaics, where PS1 structures now are being adapted to link to electrodes, so you get a more efficient transfer of electrons. If you might want to address this whole area, because I think it's fundamental, it's important in some of these long-term issues, getting biology to link to physical structures.
Well, let me comment on it. One of the issues with all of those sorts of linkages, which I think could be, in principle, very interesting for particularly high-value things, you are limited by electrode surface, and electrode surface is expensive. And so one of the things that you have to consider is when you do an interface that is a synthetic man-made interface as opposed to a grown interface, what's it going to cost? So for certain applications, I can see this as being clearly an important thing to do, but one of the great charms of biology is it grows all of its own surface, and other things don't do that. So consider that as part of your equation.
Another small advantage is that as we get to smaller and smaller feature sizes in, say, electronics, we eventually get to the point where we're talking about molecular computing, where we need atomically precise components, and biology is really good at that, while current microfabrication methods are not so good at atomically precise structures.
Okay, further comments or questions? Final comments from the panel. Now is your chance to make the single remark that will be reported in the Washington Post that will transform energy policy from now to forever. Martha, why don't we start with you?
No additional comment.
Okay.
I just want to make a comment about the acceptance, the societal acceptance that was referred to earlier with respect to the hurdles that we had and on the regulation front and so on, particularly with respect to sustainability. I sometimes think that we are forgetting the elephant in the room. We have people that may be on a route to the White House who don't believe that climate change is a problem. I think that is a much greater hurdle for some of what we do as opposed to the regulations that we face in trying to implement some of our technologies.
George?
I think I will pass as well. I think.
In which case, I thank the panel for its deep insight into a very difficult problem, a great challenge, and I thank all of you for coming.